Guess how many library locations we have? Oh, good guess. Wrong. And they work here. 28. And I'm really excited that we get to be part of what I know is going to be an evening of civil dialogue. How many of you have attended one of our Let's Talk About events? Thank you. We're really proud of that series. Yes, thank you. Somebody waved his hand enthusiastically. We're really proud of that series because sometimes we talk about things that make us uncomfortable, but we always hope that everybody goes away understanding a little bit more about who we are as a community. So thank you for that. I want to make sure that you all know, because Sacramento County is one of 5 counties piloting what it means to be 100% vote by mail. Where can you drop off your ballots? At all 28 of your local Sacramento Public Libraries. So please take advantage of the library, drop off your ballots. 11 of our libraries are also voter service centers, so if you've moved, if you're like me, I messed up one of my ballots last time, came into a voter service center, they printed out a new page for me, I was able to vote and leave it at the library. So please take advantage of that. If you're a fan of civil discourse, please plan on coming back on Sunday, October 21st. Christopher Phillips, who is the founder of the Democracy Cafe, will be here, and we'll be talking about democracy, kind of something important right now in our community and the world. So that's Sunday the 21st. If you haven't signed up for our events calendar, please do so tonight. And you can even pick up a library card and take it with you and then make it real when you come back to us. Yes? The Democracy Cafe is just part of our events calendar. We don't expect huge crowds, so just come on over. But sign up for our events newsletter, otherwise you won't know that yesterday we had an amazing author here, Leslie Lowe, who wrote the book No Place to Go about public toilets as a public policy issue. It was a really fascinating discussion, even though it was a small crowd. And finally, one way to support the library is to become a friend of the library. They provide sponsorship of so many events. They purchased the water tonight for tonight's event. If you're thirsty, please get a bottle, have a drink. I'm going to turn it over to, there you go, Hillary Fry from the Huffington Post. And thank you again for coming to Sacramento Public Library tonight.
Thank you. Hi, thank you guys all for being here tonight. My name's Hillary Fry. I'm the executive editor of HuffPost. And we're here today in partnership with the library and the Sacramento Bee to do this panel as part of our Listen to America tour. I just wanted to explain that real quick so you know why HuffPost is here in Sacramento. Last year, we did a trip across the country with a bus. We visited 25 small cities and towns across the country. We listened to people about what is happening in their communities, what's happening on the ground, what issues matter in the places where people live. I live in New York. Our main office is in New York. We have people in DC and a couple places around the country, but we get really focused on our own bubble, and it's really important that we take the time and have the opportunity to go out in the world and hear from people where they live about what's happening in their lives. So last year we did lots of interviews, and we also did events like this one tonight in partnership with local media, which is like incredibly important for HuffPost to have partners like the Sacramento Bee across the country so that we can really rely on them to help guide us when we put together events like this one. So this is very much a partnership between us tonight. And many thanks to them and again to the library for hosting us. We're thrilled to be here. And I'm just gonna hand it right over to our moderator tonight, Erica Smith. I'm sure you all know her work. She's a columnist and editorial board member at the Sacramento Bee, and she will be moderating our panel. It'll be about an hour long, roughly, maybe a little shorter here up with the panelists, but we'll also have a Q&A portion, and I'll be running your mic for that. So we'll get to the questions, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I want to first kind of introduce our panelists and just go down the list. I know probably a lot of you know them already, but I want to give a little bit more information. I'm going to start with our police chief, who's sitting to my right, Daniel Hahn. He's been Sacramento's police chief since August of 2007. He joined the department in 1987 as a community service officer and rose through the ranks to become a captain. As chief, he has made transparency a priority, opening the department to scrutiny from outside experts, strengthening department policy on body-worn cameras, and implementing a foot pursuit policy. Hahn was raised in Oak Park and was no stranger to the challenges of growing up there. At age 16, he was arrested for assaulting a police officer, which I did not know. But Hahn went on to earn degrees from Sac State and National University. He's married with 2 daughters. Next to him, I should say, is Anita Ross. She's the founder of Women for Equality, a grassroots organization dedicated to empowering women and girls to deal with low self-esteem and gender discrimination. Most recently, she has worked with Black Lives Matter, Sacramento, and other groups to seek justice for Black people killed by law enforcement. In June, Ross helped organize the 8 Days, 8 Shots protest over the death of Stephon Clark. Ross holds degrees in engineering from Stony Brook University in New York and the University of Michigan. She lives in Sacramento with her husband and 3 children. Next to her is Francine Tourneur. She is the director of the Office of Public Safety and Accountability, which is broad oversight authority to evaluate the performance of police department employees and can encourage systemic change. Specifically, her office tracks high-profile cases to their conclusion and can then reviews completed investigations. The office is under the control and the supervision of the mayor and the city council, and this is an updated version of the commission that existed a few years ago. She grew up in Oakland, has degrees in criminal justice and emergency management, and is a board member with the California Board of State of Community Corrections. And lastly, we have Bassem Alcara. He's the executive director of CARE in Sacramento Valley, which serves as a voice for the Muslim community in the area. He's been instrumental in building coalitions with ethnic and interfaith communities. Probably most relevant to this panel, he is chair of the Sacramento County Police Review Commission, which was recently reformulated to boost community participation in reviewing and recommending police department policies. So if we can get a round of applause for our panelists, and we can get started. Just to set the tone a little bit, it's been about 6 months since the night that 2 Sacramento police officers shot Stephon Clark. For those of you who don't know, the officers were responding to reports of a suspect breaking windows. They cornered him in a backyard, did not know in the dark, and shot him in South Sacramento. The officers later realized that he was holding a cell phone and not a gun. For those of us who live here, we know that that night was pretty transformative for the city. We brought us national media attention. We had protests. There was lots of demands for accountability and transparency. However, some of that's materialized, some of it is not, and there's definitely doesn't seem to be much resolution on how to move forward, and still lots of questions. So I wanted to start by probably asking a question I think is on a lot of our minds to the chief. What is the status of the investigation into the officers who shot him, and how long is it going to take before the public gets some answers?
Yes, thank you for that question. So first and foremost, there's nothing I would want more than that night to have ended differently. And I can safely say, I think, for pretty much all officers, that they wish that night had ended differently also. So specifically, the family doesn't have to go through that pain and loss, but I think it's also obviously very painful for our community and a loss for our community. In terms of the investigation, one of the things that's unique about this case, for the first time ever, at least in our department, in our city, I asked the state attorney general to independently investigate it, and also review it. And so that is happening on this case. In terms of when it's done, it will be done hopefully relatively soon, but as soon as all the facts are in, we will then turn the investigation or the final investigation over to the district attorney's office, and in this case the attorney general's office, and then they do their review or any additional investigations that they do.
And just so we're clear, because I think even as a reporter I've gotten some kind of mixed signals and answers about this. Who is actually doing what? Is the AG's office actually doing a parallel investigation? Are they doing an independent investigation? Are they helping the DA? Can you kind of enlighten us on the process and the transparency of that process?
Yeah, so they have the ability to do anything that they want. So they can interview witnesses, they can monitor interviews. They can add questions to the interview. They are not doing it for the DA. Theirs is completely separate. Not only their investigation, but their review is completely separate from the DA.
And so they will come up with, there'll be two separate reports at the end of this investigation. Is that the understanding?
Yeah, I don't know how they will report out, but they will come to their own conclusions.
And another question on the process, I mean, when there's a civilian on civilian shooting, it seems like investigations are done fairly quickly, or at least in weeks sometimes. What makes this type of shooting so different that it takes months and potentially years in some cases for these types of shootings to be investigated and results to become public?
Yeah, that's not actually always the case with even civilian on civilian. So, for example, if you had somebody coming in to rob a liquor store or something, and the store clerk ends up shooting the suspect, oftentimes nobody gets arrested for that. A lengthy investigation is conducted, and at the end of that, it's determined whether somebody gets arrested or not. So it just depends on the circumstances of the actual shooting.
But more often than not, correct me if I'm wrong, an officer-involved shooting can take a long time to investigate, it seemingly to
Yes.
get to a conclusion. So why is that so much longer than some other instances?
It's not necessarily longer than some. It just depends on the circumstances. So if it's very clear-cut and there's probable cause for civilian on civilian, then yes, it goes pretty quick, but there's still investigation that goes on behind the scene. But if there's probable cause at the scene to arrest, then that's what happens.
Okay, so realistically, is there a sense of when the public will get some answers on this case? Is it going to be another 6 months or another year? What is your...
Well, I can't speak for the DA and the Attorney General how long they're going to take in terms of reviewing the entire investigation. I'm hoping to get it to them as soon as possible. So hopefully before, obviously, well, not obviously, but before Christmas would be nice. But we'll be done as soon as we're done. As soon as we get all the evidence, we will hand it over. I cannot speak for how long it will take them to review it, but we're going as fast as we can.
This one's for Francine. I wonder if you could explain a little bit about what your role is and what, and maybe also Bassem, as far as like what the commission does, because I don't necessarily know if the public always understands exactly what that role and what you do, so I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll go first. So the Office of Public Safety Accountability, when it comes to critical incidents, the involvement is pretty narrowly focused on policy and procedures. We also have the unfortunate task of sitting with the family after the event to go through the video. There is currently a council policy that requires public release of any video associated with a critical incident. So part of my job is to sit with the loved ones of the decedent or the involved party and go through all of that video prior to it being publicly released. Outside of that, once the investigation is complete, then our office will work with the police department to look at policies, procedures, and anything that may need to be addressed with training.
So for the Police Review Commission, we're tasked with reviewing policy and giving recommendations to City Council for them to change these policies. It can be changing policies or adding new policies.
And this commission that you sit on is different than one that existed a couple of years ago, correct?
Yes. Previously you applied. Now it's by City Council members appoint someone, and then the mayor appoints 3 seats to the commission.
So, and maybe this is a question for both you and Francine, but when it comes to police shootings, what exactly does your role as far as how do you fit into the process between the police department, what the DA is doing? Where does your role come in?
Well, for the commission, we look at the policies, and for example, Assembly Bill 931, the Weber-McCarty bill on changing reasonable to necessary use of force, the commission came out, looked at it, and feels strongly that this needs to be changed. And so we passed a motion to City Council for them to adopt and support legislation, any legislation that changes it from reasonable to necessary use of force.
And just to clarify, so Assembly Bill 931, which was shelved at the end of the session, didn't get enough votes in the Senate, but basically would have changed use of force standards to make them, I guess, stronger, I think is probably the word. And you had mentioned that the city of Sacramento is doing something specifically for that. So how would that work with the city if that motion is passed with the council in the city?
Well, you know, the city council can ask the department to change it internally, so we don't have to wait until legislation changes it, that we do it internally here. And also for me, so I wear two hats. So I'm on the commission, but I'm also on the department's use of force committee, where we're trying to speed up the process of changing policies. And so, for example, food pursuit policy, the recent change of over a month ago. And so some community members working with the police department are trying to speed up internally. So the commission gives recommendations to city council, and then this use of force committee is trying to change it internally to speed up the process.
And Chief, do you have thoughts on that process or that policy change that potentially could be happening?
Which policy?
This is on use of force in AB 31, the equivalent standards.
Yeah, I haven't read 931 in depth. In theory, I don't have any problem with the word necessary, because when I say necessary, I would hope that nobody shoots anybody unless it's necessary. The questions I would have are more for attorneys, is what legally will that mean? And I've heard about 5 different things from attorneys what legally necessary would mean. So that would be my only question on that. I'm not automatically opposed to it. I just need to know what it legally means.
And what's the current use of force standard for Sacramento Police, just so we all understand?
Well, basically a reasonable person would have felt that their life was in danger of somebody else's.
And has that changed at all in given some of the shootings in recent years at all? Has it gotten stricter or not?
That language?
That language, yes.
No.
And this also is to Francine. Your office, you do reports on specific cases. Are you able to release reports before the district attorney comes up with her?
So OPSA does not rely at all on the district attorney's report or their findings because, like I mentioned before, it's very specific to policy. So the DA looks at the legality of a shooting, where we're looking at the policy and whether or not, even if the officers acted within the current policy, is there a necessary need for change or training or whatever it is? Our biggest interest is to try and prevent that same event from happening again. And whether that comes through training, education to the community, some other forms of outreach, whether that be to the community or the police department, we're trying to prevent critical incidents from happening by any means.
And Chief, how do you feel like the department is doing with that? I mean, I know that there was obviously the Stephon Clark shooting that led to this, but there's also been several other shootings that have happened since then. The department has gotten a lot of pushback about that. Where do you think we stand as a city on those issues?
Well, obviously, I wish none of these ever happened. So if we can do things that, regardless of what that means, through training or through culture or through policy, doesn't really matter to me as long as we do everything we can to prevent shootings like this. So nothing ever goes as fast as I would ideally like it, but we have in my mind, we have 2 responsibilities anytime something like this happens. Is one, to investigate that specific shooting, and were those officers within policy and were they within the law. But the other thing is there anything that we can do better? And even if at the end of the day it's within the law, there's oftentimes you can still do something better in a way that would result in a different outcome. And so I think we have looked at that and are continuing to look at that. So I think we're making progress, but obviously it could always be faster and always come up with solutions, but that's what we're working towards.
Anita, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, from the activist, point of view standpoint. What are your thoughts on kind of what's going on right now in the city and how the police department is responding?
I believe that the community has been crystal clear about the pain that we're experiencing, what it is we want, particularly around Stephon Clark, the case with Stephon Clark, and why we want it. We want justice for Stephon Clark, his family, and this community. And I believe that we have been loud and clear, and I don't feel like there's an acknowledgement that we have an issue, that young black boys and black men are being killed by use of excessive force at the law enforcement level, at the city official level, and beyond. So that would be a start. And I think that we have the opportunity right now with this particular case to do that. I really believe that that would be a beginning to the healing in this city and to address some of the pain, and then follow through with what it takes to ensure that this issue of humanity stops.
When you say acknowledgement, what specifically are you looking for?
It's a great question. I've spoken up at City Council multiple times, and I really feel that there are city officials here that don't take our pain seriously, and don't necessarily acknowledge in any form or fashion. I feel like they stand in their official capacity and that their hands are tied, but sometimes it just takes an acknowledgement that we see you, that we feel your pain, and step into leadership, you know, and go against the grain and say that we know that we have an issue. We know that right now Black lives are at stake, and you know, and that Black lives matter. To me, that's an acknowledgement, and it doesn't seem to be the popular way. And I think a lot of the people in the community are looking for that.
Let's talk a little bit about what happened after Stephon Clark. I mean, I think that's kind of when the Sacramento became national news, when folks, you know, protested the city council meeting and shut down a couple of, at least two, I think, Sacramento Kings games over the course of the week, and the highway a number of times. How do you think the city's response to that was? Like, I don't know if you want to grade it, but how do you think that, what would have made it better and what was wrong, I guess I should say?
I don't think that it was wrong. I was at the initial, the beginning of the protest that led to the shutdown of the first Kings game. And I saw the people's anguish, and Black Lives Matter Sacramento was incremental into creating a situation that would get national attention. And I think it was absolutely necessary. I know it was not popular. I saw the comments about why are they shutting down the highway and making it inconvenient for people to get home to their children. And my first thought was, well, you know what? Stephon Clark will never get home to his children. And if I gotta be inconvenienced and call, you know, someone to pick up my children, it's okay if this is gonna lead to national attention, which it did, and create a conversation that needs to be had.
It seemed to mark a different type of protest for Sacramento. I mean, I know I've only been here a little less than 4 years, but from the feedback that I've heard, that's not the kind of reaction we've had in general for anything that kind of, that taking that drastic extreme to shut down a freeway. Is there, and you know, there's been several protests since then, none of which have become violent, but passionate for sure. Do you think that those types of protests will continue until there is more of an acknowledgement, or what kind of, I guess, is that kind of going to be our new normal, do you think?
I can't say for sure. I know that for me, I will continue to stand alongside Black Lives Matter Sacramento and LEAD and Live Free and Sacramento area congregations together, as many organizations that will come together to create attention. Right now, we're bleeding and we need to address it. And if we're going to come together to create something that's going to wake folks up, and unfortunately it's something like you know, shutting down a Kings game, but if that's going to wake people up and see the severity of the situation, then we will continue to do that. I think the one thing we really don't want is to just get complacent and to just sit in this you know, waiting, this kind of waiting for this investigation. Every time I say investigation, I put a quote unquote because it just doesn't feel real. And there's a lack of trust there between the community and law enforcement and the DA and the folks that are in charge of this investigation. That's the feeling that's out there.
Chief, do you have any thoughts about the way that the protests have gone, you know, since then, and whether it's a right or a wrong way, or how things you hope should be handled?
Yeah, I'd actually agree with just about everything that Anita just said. But let me say first, as some people in this room know, I left Sacramento, where I've lived my entire life, to work anyway. I didn't move, but to Roseville to be police chief for about 6.5 years. The reason I came home, and you can listen to my swearing-in speech, and I said this in my speech, that the reason I came home was to change this dynamic that we're talking about. This lack of trust in certain segments of our community between the community and the police department, and for once and for all change or work towards changing that dynamic that has been here since the inception of this country. And so that's why I came home. And I think at the time I believed that Sacramento was, specifically Sacramento was poised to do that. And I think this is an opportunity for us to do exactly that. At one point early in my career, the police department was one of the leaders in the country of community-oriented policing, and departments came from all over this country and all over the world to see what we were doing. I think this is another one of those moments where we can get something that has plagued our communities from the beginning of this country and get it right and do something that's meaningful, that we don't have these same conversations, that my daughters, when they get my age, aren't having these conversations. In terms of the protests, I mean, I looked at them basically as a way to bring attention to the issue, and I think they did exactly that. But again, I don't think it does any of us good if at the end of this, if 20 years from now, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, we haven't made any progress in, one, keeping everybody safe in our community, but also changing the feeling that the community and the police department has for each other in certain areas of town or certain segments of our community. If that doesn't change, then all of this was just a pain in the neck, right? And so that's what I came back to do. That's what I'm gonna work the rest of my career on. And so, so most of what Anita said, I agree with.
So what specifically have you done as far as increasing transparency? I know you've been doing some work since becoming chief.
Yeah, I think some of the stuff is what I'd call more minor, and we're working more on the real big stuff. And so the big stuff, I think, is more the culture and the relationship. The more, I don't want to say easier, but the quicker victories are things like, well, while the state was discussing these bills about releasing body camera footage in 45 days, we released it in 3 days. We released audio tape in the same day. We release, I don't know any other department that releases video the way we do. So that has changed in literally the last 6 months. And so there's been a tremendous amount of change. In the last year, every officer has body cameras. A year ago, not every officer had body cameras. There's departments that don't have body cameras. There's departments that do have body cameras but don't release footage. We do all of it. And I would say on the culture front, we've done a lot of things. And I don't have enough time to name all of them. But the way we recruit, the way we hire now is evolving and changing. So we get the kind of folks that we're looking for that are going to be good for our community, even if they've made some mistakes in their past where traditionally they might have been kicked out of backgrounds. Things like we just recently had a deputy chief promotion test, a captain's promotion test, a lieutenant's promotion test, a sergeant's promotion test. The deputy chiefs and captains, part of the testing process is they were required and tested on reading the post-traumatic slave syndrome. The lieutenants were tested and required to read Blind Spot. So things like that, there's many more, but things like that is what's meant to expand people's experiences so they're better able to patrol and work and relate to our entire community. Some of the other things, we just recently did Day of Service up in the North area in Del Paso Heights, where the recent Academy graduates spend a day in whatever the community wants them to do. So the first half of the day they did cleanup, then they had lunch together, and then they had breakout sessions where brand new officers and community members shared and had very honest conversations. We also have implemented Walk in My Shoes, where each of those Academy graduates and the field training officers have to walk with a community leader in a neighborhood that they're not from. And then that community leader rides with them for a half a day, and then they get back together in the third month and explain what they learned and experienced and grew about. So those are just a couple of the things, but those are all meant to change the relationship, or more specifically for our new officers, have them have a little bit better experiences and understanding of neighborhoods that they're not necessarily from before they ever put on the uniform and go into those communities as a police officer.
How does training for non-lethal force, how does that fit into this? Because it sounds like a lot of the things you're talking about are culture, which seems to take time, where some more training about how officers day to day is something that potentially could be more immediate.
Yeah, so over the last year also, we've equipped all officers with beanbag shotguns and other less lethal force, so there's a lot of training that goes into that with de-escalation. So all that stuff should flow together. So you have more of a cultural type class that should be then played out in your scenarios when you have a scenario that involves somebody in mental health crisis. How do you handle that? That all should be woven in throughout all the training.
And for Bassem and Francine, how, when you evaluate cases, I mean, and now there's these new rules for training, do you look at that as far as looking at how an officer, assessing a case?
Well, the commission can't evaluate cases. We'll ask questions, but for us to just to give policy recommendations. But what we are requesting is data. So data on use of force, and what we've recommended recent City Council is to provide data on a monthly basis and make it public, not just for the commissioners, but for the public, and also so to see trends, what's happening with the department, what's happening out there with how many number of use of force cases, and as much demographic information on both the officer and the community member, and to see if we can find patterns there.
And is that in hopes of building trust with the public, or what's the goal of that?
It's a two-way street. It is to build confidence with the public that there's transparency, but also internally for the department to see what patterns and if there's a negative pattern to make sure that they're addressing it. So the data is there, and then we're requesting some more demographic data on top of that.
And while we're on the subject of transparency and data, another bill that was passed was SB 1421, Nancy Skinner's bill that looked at transparency. How is that, or will that affect some of what you do, and maybe what you do, Francine, as far as looking at officers and the public's access? Basically, this bill, or now law, allows the public to have access to personnel records that were previously confidential in a lot of cases.
Well, it doesn't change the position of my job at all, because currently any information that's at the police department I do have access to. So in regards to your previous question, I think that a lot of what happens regarding building trust is not necessarily centered around the critical incidents. It happens on the day-to-day interactions that the community has with the police. So quite often, I will look at complaints that come in. I'll review additional video. The police department does have body-worn cameras, so I won't just simply focus on the officer that's accused, but everybody else that may be involved with the complaint or an issue, to see how they are dealing with the public. And it's very important that one community gets the same level of respect and police professionalism as another community. So that's quite often what I'm looking for, and trying to figure out how to make sure that's what's happening in the police department.
Is that improving, would you say?
I think that it does improve, because with body-worn cameras, the officers are aware that they are on camera. So with I know there was a new improvement to the current policy that they're not supposed to turn off their cameras during interaction. So I think that when you know that you're being watched and all of that can be reviewed, it does help you put your best foot forward when you're dealing with the public. But it's something that I would like to see even when that camera isn't on. But I would say that I have seen some improvement.
Anita, and I know you're keenly aware, but there was a recent shooting of a teenager, Daryl Roberts, he's not a teenager. But there was a recent shooting where the officer's body camera was not on. So, I mean, what did that do as far as the transparency and trust?
It breaks the trust even deeper. And the fact that isn't immediately addressed in loud and clear, right? Because what is shared in the media is that he was holding this, and he was doing that, and he was suspicious, but it wasn't broadly broadcasted that they shut off their body cam, right? We had to see the footage, we had to get the footage, and so again, if you want to talk about a path towards transparency, then put it all out on the table. And I understand the preservation of life, but let's preserve Black lives as well, right? He's a teenager.
Was there, other than putting it out there from the beginning, I mean, was there a way, how would you have liked to have seen that situation handled? Like, the incident happened, he was killed, would have been initially being like, yes, this officer's body camera was off and this is why? Would have helped preserve trust, or was it the fact that he was shot anyway that would have?
I'm the mother of a 6-year-old black son, and it's personal. So I would want to see Daryl Richards alive, right? And so whatever it would have taken to preserve his life is what I would have rather seen. But if, given the situation and the way that it went down, yes, absolutely, out front, this is not okay, this is against policy, this will be addressed with some sort of accountability. That's what we need. That's what we need.
Do you have any response to that? Anybody else on the panel? And this can be a conversation. You guys don't have to wait for me to ask a question. So, Chief, you're the man. Do you have a response? No? Okay. So what do you do? I mean, there's policies that have been implemented. You know, there's cases where those policies aren't followed. How do you deal with that?
Well, yeah, we have a full-time internal affairs unit. The reason we have that is because we have to investigate officers whenever there's an allegation, most of which come internally. And so that's why we have that unit. It's a full-time unit. And so, you know, officers have rights, there's laws, and so we have to investigate things fully before we can take any action. I can tell you we hold many officers accountable all the time. And so in terms of saying why somebody's camera is off or that it was off, we have to investigate that to know why it was off before we can say why it was off. So in that case, I think we released the body cameras and that information within a week. So again, in California, we're talking about 45 days, and then again, there we did it within a week. And so oftentimes we don't put out opinion, we just put out the videos and let people, I mean, that's what I think is important, that people, to the best of their ability and our ability, right? Videos only show so much, but if there's a video, then we put it out so people can see for themselves and come to their own conclusions.
And so you're saying in that particular case, the officer is probably or is under investigation over the camera incident. Is that how it would typically be handled, a violation of a policy?
Yes. So again, every one of these, we look at the specific case with the specific officers that are involved, and what did they do, and was it within policy and all that. But then we also look at how could we be better. So even if at the end of the day they were in policy for whatever reason, body cameras are off, and that's a problem. And so whether it's their responsibility individually why they're off, or us as an organization, we need to fix that. And so we need to work on both of those.
And have you come up with some recommendation to, as a result of this incident, to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Yes, we've come up with some temporary solutions to it. But the permanent ones, we're working with the manufacturer of the body cameras to come up with some more permanent solutions that are long-lasting.
And refresh all of our memories, what does the current policy on body cameras say?
Well, it says a lot of things, but
Well,
in general, you're supposed to have that camera on basically from the beginning of the call to the end of the call.
Why was it off? We can ask that. Do you know why it was off?
It's still, you know, I have some ideas, but we're still investigating, so I'm not at liberty to talk too much about that right now.
But we're gonna have Q&A in about 10 minutes, and you can feel free to ask the question then, but we want to try to keep it to the panel, at least at this point. I'll go through a few more questions, but definitely get your questions ready. This one's for Anita. Talking about, you know, protests and groups going forward, I mean, there's a lot to talk about, but there's also just, you know, the activist community seems to be growing here. I mean, in lots of different groups, you named several, yours included. Is it important to keep on mission, or is it important to, how do you see this progressing as our activist community here in Sacramento kind of becomes more robust and mature, I guess is one way to put it?
Yeah, so we are growing, we're strong and mighty, and I think we're all going on full, with all pistons fired, sometimes in parallel and sometimes we're coming together, and all in the name of the end game, which is justice, and ensuring that Black lives are lifted up in this moment in our city, in the state, and in our nation, because that's what's being called to be lifted up. And so I would say, there's a unity, not necessarily a uniformity. So we all have our ways, but all in parallel and going for the same end game, the same vision.
And what does justice look like? I think I may have asked you this once before, but you say the end game is justice, but what is that? Is that a public policy thing? Is that a feeling? What does that look like to you? And I won't ask you to answer for all activists everywhere in Sacramento.
For me, at the end of the day, when love wins, and that's really what Women for Equality is about. And so justice looks like until a day where, everyone recognizes their worth and understands that we all matter, and there's this idea that we understand that the next person matters. Until that day, then we need to have justice, which is accountability, which looks like I see you, you matter, acknowledgement that there's an issue. So it's all different levels. It's at the humanity level, it's at the city official level, it's the legislative level, but all aspects aligning with what is morally correct. To me, that's what justice looks like. And it feels good.
It feels good.
I'm going to add, it's when there's a bad shooting, the officer is prosecuted. I mean, we look at the shooting in Chicago, Laquan McDonald, and there was justice for his family when the officer was found guilty. And there's these shootings that take place there's some shootings that the activists will recognize they're justified, but when these type of cases, to show the country and the world that we hold people accountable, that there's no double standard. And so that, I think, was a major victory for the movement, and justice was served in Chicago. And I think also here, before Stephon Clark, I mean, BLM was engaged before that because there's been shootings around the country, and I think our nation has recognized that we have a problem with police shootings. And for us also in Sacramento, it was the Joseph Mann shooting. So people were already, were already on edge with all these shootings, and so this kind of was the tip of the iceberg. And for many it was personal. Many folks, knew Stephon Clark. For me, I've known the grandfather of his children for over a decade. So this one hit close to home. And so I think people are going to be engaged on this issue and realize that we can't stop now. And I think, and also to be fair to the chief, because I worked with the chief when he was over in Roseville, and he worked on unconscious bias training and diversity training. So he knew that there are these challenges. But we got to keep going. And it's, I talked to a lot of officers, and there's good intentions. I'll tell you, after that jaywalking incident, one officer was telling me, it's like, we have to stop, when folks are jaywalking, we have to stop them because that's how we get drugs and guns off the street. I said, okay, you have a good intention, but do you understand what that does to young black and brown men and boys? The trauma that takes place? And so there's a disconnect. And when you have an officer, and we're trying to push for more diversity, when you have an officer that grew up in Oak Park, an officer that grew up in Del Paso Heights versus someone that grew up in Placer County that maybe doesn't know the history of what the black and brown communities have gone through, right? Then there is a disconnect when they come and work in these communities. So we got to push for more diversity. We got to push for more folks from the community to get into law enforcement. And that's how we're gonna bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, and also to promote a positive public health. So when folks, black and brown folks, are pulled over, right? The trauma, just getting pulled over for any minor thing, there's a lot of trauma there, and that trauma is not just from what they've experienced, what their parents have experienced, what their grandparents have experienced. I mean, and so we're not disconnected from history, and I think sometimes there is a disconnect from agencies when they don't understand the history. And I always remind folks, as I look, in South Central LA in the 60s, what led up to the Watts riots? You had an African-American pastor with his family. He was going to his church, and then maybe went through the wrong block, and then the officers would pull him out in front of his family, humiliate him, and beat him down. And that's what was happening to young black and brown men all over. And so then it erupted. So we can't wait until something like that happens. And right now, it's both. It's both the community and law enforcement it's not just about a good intention, it's about changing policy. And I think that's what we've committed to here in Sacramento. But the thing is, how do we speed up the process? Because when we speed up the process, we actually save lives. And I think that's what we're trying to do now.
Nita, you look like you had something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I was reading an article about Jordan Edwards, the case in, I think it's Dallas, Texas. Don't quote me on Dallas, but I know it's Texas, where the Texas officer was found guilty of murder. And I was reading a quote from the father, and the father said that when he heard that, he jumped up with joy. And I can't even, imagine having lost a son and then be able to do that. And I just want to, it took the general attorney and it took the DA. We have issue here with our DA here having a track record of not holding folks accountable, law enforcement accountable. And they really dug deep over there, and we need to take notice of what folks are doing. And just to piggyback on that, I think it's really important for us to get out the vote and use all activists and all people to use our vote to vote people out who are not standing with us on these issues. So, that's critical.
And both of you mentioned Laquan McDonald and Jordan Edwards. Do you think that the cases in these other states where the officers actually are held accountable, do you think it raises questions here for people, like if it happens there, why not here? And how do you think that plays out? I mean, I was happy to see the officer was held accountable in Laquan McDonald as well as Jordan Edwards, but I do think there's the sense that people are like, well, why does that not happen here? And I don't know if you get that, Chief, at all.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think part of our problem, you mentioned 1421, or I think that's the bill. I get confused with all the different bills. But you mentioned the bill that is more transparency, basically, with the new rules that will kick in a little bit about revealing portions of personnel files of officers. And I've said long before any of these incidents happened that over time, you always have to evolve, and I think we do have to evolve in terms of what we release about officers. I don't have the exact answers of where it ultimately needs to land, but it does seem like part of the problem with transparency is I'm literally not able to speak about any of it. Literally, like it's against the law until soon for me to speak about it. So there's been, some fairly recent cases in Sacramento that the only reason what the department did is because the employee themselves went to some of the local media outlets. But I literally couldn't tell you anything. And so I do think there's some evolution that could be had in that area, that it won't be the sole solution. It takes many things to get over what has plagued us from the beginning. But I do think that's one, that somewhere there should be some sort of happy medium or some way that we can get more information out about what takes place in some of these investigations. And I don't know exactly where that should ultimately land, but I know it needs to move.
So 1421, it sounds like it could be a good thing for you in that public relations aspect.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't worked all the way through what it literally is going to mean for the department in terms of workload and all those things, and what it literally will mean that we release. We're still having the attorneys tell us that. But I do think it's the fact that we're talking about it and moving on it, I don't think is a bad thing. Officers, have rights too, and have families and safety issues too, so we have to take all sides into consideration. But I do think there's some room to move in terms of getting information out. Otherwise, I can hold somebody completely accountable and it's going to seem as if we didn't.
How do you, given your counterpart in Sacramento County, Sheriff Scott Jones, who has shunned any attempt, or most attempts anyway, at accountability and transparency, and your department basically has not compared to that, how does that work out for you? I mean, is it make things harder or easier, or because it seems like you guys are in some ways polar opposites in how you approach issues with the public?
Well, I think in one sense it causes challenges because there's two different things in basically the same community. But in terms of both together, I'm very comfortable with what I believe in. I'm very comfortable with why I came home. I'm very comfortable with where I believe we need to go in terms of law enforcement and our relationship with the community. And so I'm going to do what is best for my community and my police department, and he's going to be responsible for his.
I'm going to open it up for questions as somebody, oh, you're someone with the microphone.
Hi, my name is Betty Williams, president of the NAACP, and my question is in regards to transparency. We just recently met with the DA regarding the Stephon Clark to see what was going on, and she said they hadn't received it yet because SAC PD still had it. And so our question was also with the AG. We met with them the next day to find out what was going on. And so just the answers just seem different. And to our community, it feels like a cover-up. So she says it can't do anything until they receive anything from SAC PD. The AG tells us that Internal Affairs is actually doing the investigation, and AG is there doing policy research, not an investigation. So then I hear you on the stage saying there's going to be another investigation with Internal Affairs, AG, and the DA is waiting on it. So this all happened within the last 72 hours. So I'm really confused on your answer right now. So it just appears that it's a cover-up in some kind of way.
Yeah, let me clear that up then. That does seem very confusing. So Internal Affairs is not doing this investigation, the criminal investigation. There's two investigations that the department does. One is the legal, if you will, investigation. That's what the Attorney General, the District Attorney will review. That's what we're finishing up right now. And then there's a separate investigation that's done by the department in terms of whether there's policy violations and things like that. So one's legal, that the DA and the Attorney General ultimately have the decision on legal charges or not. And so the Attorney General, what's probably confusing about that is the Attorney General is doing two things. One, they're doing an independent investigation on the legal side, and then they will review it when it's done. They're legal people, they're different people, so they have investigators and then they have their attorneys that review it. But they're also, I can't remember the exact name, but their Civil Rights Division, I think is the name of it, is reviewing our use of force policies, practices, statistics, and things. So those are two totally separate things, two totally separate departments within the Attorney General's office. They're doing both of those. The district attorney is waiting on the investigation, and so is the legal side of the Attorney General's office, although they do have two investigators that are actively participating independently of the investigation. The other side of the Attorney General office, the Civil Rights Division, has been doing their thing since we asked them 2 months ago or whenever that was. So they've been actively over in the Internal Affairs Division. That's probably where the confusion came. That side is looking at Internal Affairs review because they're reviewing our practices, and totally separate from the actual case in general. What are the practices of the police department? What's the training? What's the policies? And they're going to come back with recommendations. I might also add Stanford University is doing something similar where we've opened up our department to Stanford University. They're doing a review and going to provide recommendations. The Center for Policing Equity is doing the same thing. And we've been working since before I even came back to Sacramento with UC Davis in regards to an implicit bias training and program. So we have, I don't know every single department in the country, but I don't know of any departments that's doing as many independent, working with totally outside people, fully opening up our department, willingly doing that as opposed to being under a consent decree or something like that. You mean the Attorney General and the DA?
Right, Attorney General, DA, you.
Well, we're hoping to be done soon because we've been investigating since the beginning, but how long they will take to review the investigation, I don't know. I mean, some have taken 6 months, some have taken longer in the past. I mean, I can't speak for them.
So the whole reason that we're even here is because Huffington Post saw the urgency from across the country. So we all know that there's an urgency and we can't take our time doing these things. Since Stephon Clark's murder, there's been 3 new policies that have come out. You did a policy on the cameras and how they're handled. You did a new policy on the foot pursuit. And then there's also a policy on using less lethal forms of force. In any of those in all of those policies, there's not been any consequences put in stone in those policies, and so they have been violated. And for that reason, that you can't say anything, we don't know what's happening with those violations. When are you going to start making policies that have consequences attached to them, so that we know that when you make a rule and it's broken, that something is going to happen? Because right now, we don't know anything. We don't see anything. By the
Yeah,
way,
so
I'm Tanya with Black Lives Matter Sacramento.
So all of our policies have consequences. If you violate a policy, there's a consequence, every one of them. In terms of being able to say what those consequences are, we're very limited right now of what we can say and who we can say it to. So that's where we're at right now. There's consequences to all of our policy. It just depends on what the circumstances are. There's consequences to all of our policies.
So are those consequences that are listed, I guess to your point, Tanya, is that what's covered under by law in California, that you cannot say what those consequences are? Or is that, I guess, is that in the policy book? I guess, is it spelled out anywhere where the public can get to it, where if, say, you don't leave your body camera on in this instance, you get 2 days suspension? Like, I'm making that up, obviously, but is there a specific...
Well, it's very hard to say with any policy that this exact consequence will happen, because there's all sorts of variables that go in. On officers, whenever they go to a call, there's no two calls that are exactly the same or two circumstances that are exactly the same. So it's very difficult to put one specific consequence to a policy. But they're basically policies, like if I gave somebody discipline that is way out of the norm, then the attorneys would appeal it, and the arbitrator or the courts would overturn it to keep it within the normal bounds. So there's consequences to all of our policies. There's lengthy appeals processes that can be taken on behalf of the employees. And so every case is different, but there's absolutely, you don't have a policy that if you violate that nobody cares. That's what policies are for.
Alianne Murphy Hassan, Greater Sacramento NAACP, First VP. My question, you talk about training. Is the training mandatory? And if the training is not mandatory, where does that leave, those officers that said, I'm opting out? Or if the training is for 1 year, after a year, then you don't have to take the training any longer. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, it just depends on what kind of training. Most of the training that we're probably referring to here tonight is mandatory. So some of it is mandatory through POST, which is Police Officer Standards and Training, that governs all training in California. A significant portion of the academy training is mandated, but we also add a significant portion of that training that's not mandated by POST, it's mandated by the department. So things like implicit bias training, procedural justice, all those things are mandatory. So every officer has to get them. They typically get them every couple of years. Everyone has a cycle that every so often they have to have a retraining or the whole course again or the new version of that course. So it really depends. A lot of the training that's not mandatory are specific to a certain assignment. For example, if you wanted to work narcotics, there's training around the state that's like narcotics training. So if you were interested in narcotics, you could elect to go to that training, but it's not mandatory. That's mandatory. That's mandatory. Well, every officer has to go through, every one of our officers goes through 40 hours of training every year, similar to what teachers do, where they have to go get training every year to maintain their teacher certificate. Well, officers have a very similar thing. Their post certificate has to be post mandates. I think it's 24 hours every 2 years. Our officers are all required to go 40 hours every year.
And just to clarify, because I know you probably couldn't hear her, she was asking how often does that training occur? And if we can keep it to one question, just because the microphone disappears and then nobody else can hear, so, and particularly the people that are being streamed online, so.
I'll answer that specifically. Every officer is mandated that they do 40 hours of training every year. Now, most officers do a lot more than that, but the minimum mandatory is 40.
Hello, I'm a concerned parent in Sacramento that has been going through a situation that I'm sure some of you on the panel are aware of. However, growing up in San Francisco, where I attended 6 high schools, and my daughter didn't make it through 1. And I have ADHD and she does too. Francine, I'm glad you can smile because I can too, honey. So like I'm saying, I've contacted 7 city officials. I've contacted 10 county officials and 14 state officials. No one has checked on any of these children. I wrote to the U.S. Congress June the 12th for a formal federal lawsuit to come out July the 12th. So I must have been ahead of someone. However, now I'm being railroaded by a criminal system after I've been a foster parent here, that I am being charged with a child endangerment charge because my child's attempting to harm herself. While we have 18,000 children in the Natomas Unified School District that has been utilized as human subjects, protocol number 13-14-019 by a Gregory Fisher with no parent's knowledge, that's not okay. Now I'm in the Senator Kamala Harris' office having a conference call with them. Mr. Hahn, I've approached you twice. Your best friend, Cecil Williams, sold my home. I said, sir, could you please speak to me? Now, I have no help.
Did you have a question in that?
So now I want to know, how does anyone involved with the public safety, our Office of Public Safety Accountability, Daniel Hahn, I've reached out to you. How do you feel about the children when I can say for a fact that there is something wrong in the educational system and I'm a parent willing to help, but now I'm being threatened to go to jail?
Okay, I don't know anything about that, so, and we're not in charge of the educational system, so I'm not sure how to answer that.
Ma'am, we're going to try to keep it to the microphone and the questions. There's some other people that have questions. We want to make sure. Okay. Okay. Okay.
Okay. My name's Ayotunde. I'm with Black Lives Matter Sacramento. I just wanted to know, in the body cam law, is there a conditional statement that justifies ever turning body cams off?
There is a couple times, like for example, if a victim, like a sex assault victim, will not give a statement unless the camera's off. There's a few examples like that. And that could probably, we're still working on revisions, so that could change again. But it's very limited. Part of the problem with the body-worn camera was, one, they're a very new piece of equipment for this department, and so there wasn't a lot of language that specifically talked to muting at that time, and now there is.
We want to, I think you can answer that, but like I said, we want to keep it to one question just because we want to make sure we want to get through some of the questions. Thank you. Okay. What he's asking is if there's...
Can they turn it off sometime during a shooting? No.
So, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Oh, you got it? Thank you. Hi. So the president made some remarks earlier today regarding sending the Attorney General to Chicago to implement stop and frisk. Given that race was such a central component to today's conversation, and given what we know about stop and frisk and its effects and how it was implemented in New York City, why is it that this policy is seen so favorably by the nation's top law enforcement, and what can we tell our fellow citizens when it comes time to vote, why this policing philosophy is so ineffective in helping bridge a divided country?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the middle part. Why is what with the top law enforcement official?
So the president had suggested sending the Attorney General to implement stop and frisk in Chicago. So my question was, why is it that this policing philosophy of stop and frisk is seen so favorably by the nation's top law enforcement, the Attorney General and the president?
Yeah, I don't know that it is. I wasn't at that conference. I'm here, but I did read that. There's some specific rules about when you can stop and pat somebody down. So I don't think there's any confusion here about when you can do that. So I'm not sure how they handle it in New York City and some of these other places, but there's some well-established case law on when you can stop and pat somebody down here. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Norma Nelson. I'm with the League of Women Voters, Sacramento County. And I have a question regarding the Peace Officer Bill of Rights, and specifically for you, Chief, how that impacts your ability to discipline bad cops.
Well, I don't know that it necessarily stops the ability to discipline officers that have violated policy or the law. It does set a lot of procedures into place on how you have to go about interviewing people and things like that. So it's just a matter of you just have to go through those procedures. The part I was talking about earlier is the part of what we can say about it afterwards. Because I know there's specific cases that I've spoken publicly about that I'm very limited in. Matter of fact, I've had to meet with attorneys to go over and over about what exactly can I say and can't I say. And at the end of that, people are left wondering what actually happened because I can't specifically say. So that's what I meant earlier by I think there's some movement that can be made on that in certain cases that we're able to say something, which we're not really now.
Piggyback on that on 1 second. One of the complaints about the Peace Officers Bill of Rights is that it allows officers to move from department to department that have been, for lack of a better term, bad cops. Is that a concern of yours as you kind of, do hiring and want to get a more diverse workforce?
Yeah, I heard that a couple of months ago too. Quite frankly, I don't understand why somebody would say that, because the Police Officers Bill of Rights has absolutely nothing to do with officers going from department to department. So if I'm a Sacramento police officer and I decide I've been in trouble or something and I've gotten disciplined and so I want to leave this department and go to another department. Well, every department I know has you sign a piece of paper that basically waives all your rights, that says, I will open my last department's personnel file, my internal affairs file, my personnel file, all things at my old department are open to you. And if you don't sign that, we don't even do a background on you. So for example, anybody we do a background on, we go to those departments and we sit down in the office with their internal affairs files, their personnel files, and we look through all of it. So I don't think POBR has anything to do with officers going from department to department. Now, there might be a department that doesn't require you to do that, but that isn't because of POBR. That's because that department doesn't do a thorough background investigation.
Sonia Lewis with Black Lives Matter Sacramento. A lot of the questions that have been placed tonight from the audience member have to do with training, and I think that training has a lot to do with trust. And you've mentioned, Chief Hahn, that the department has some new training, and those trainings were before the Daryl Richards shooting, as well as your chief, I think you said captain and lieutenant are reading things like the post-traumatic slave syndrome, which are nice pieces of literature to put on for PR purposes, but we are seeing that the training is not working. And I'm saying it's not working because your department went through non-lethal force training, and their SWAT was called in to take care of Daryl Richards' case. So how does SWAT de-escalate, and how is the training working, especially when we are in communities that are experiencing things like post-traumatic slave syndrome and ACEs and just continued trauma from the law enforcement in general?
Well, I think anytime you're getting better, I think the training is working. That will constantly evolve. There's always new equipment, new training, new ways of doing things. In terms of that specific case, I can't really say anything on that because we're still in the middle of the investigation of exactly what and why and how things happened on that. But we should always be looking for training that makes us better. So even when things aren't necessarily against the law or current policy, if there's ways we can do it better and to have a different outcome, that's what we should be searching for.
Got about 10 minutes left, so we want to get, 2 or 3 more questions in.
Thank you. I'm Gina Clater, just a citizen. Jumping back to consequences of police officers as they're being reprimanded, does the police union ever step in and prevent or hinder consequences being implemented?
Well, the police union is no different than any other union. So they, at times, will fight for their employees. There's a whole process for that. So there's appeal processes, courts that ultimately it can land in that goes in front of a judge, arbitrators and things like that. So typically, yeah, if you issue discipline that the union or the attorneys don't agree with, then they will go to those arbitrators or the courts and say their side, and at some point in every one of those levels, somebody makes a decision whether they're right or we're right.
Hi there, my name is Brian Lincoln. I'm a local real estate broker in the South area, and my job's given me an opportunity to see people from all over the city and experience different parts of the city. One thing I wanted to know is, well, I would like to, number one, thank the city of Sacramento the police department for completely changing the way its policies and treatment towards people. But is there any interagency cooperation or any opportunity for the police within the city to have an influence on the treatment of people by the police in the county areas?
Well, I think the opportunities are always there. We work a lot together on calls and different things, but in terms of ultimately any official authority in the county, no, we do not.
My name is Rhonda Rios-Kravitz. I work with the Sacramento Immigration Coalition, and I'm here because we've seen profound fractures of trust among communities of color, black and brown immigrant communities. But one solution or practice that has not been discussed on the panel is putting in place strong and effective independent civilian review boards. Those boards would have subpoena powers independent of investigative authorities. They would have the ability to review and audit policies. They would have secure funding. They would be nominated by civic organizations. They would have quarterly reports that are put in a timely fashion. Why has this city or county not put in place those kinds of review boards?
I think that's for you, Francine, or maybe you can buy some.
Well,
I'm not an elected official, so that's definitely not for me.
Well, I'll tell you, you look at Oakland, the voters, they took matters into their own hands. There's so many consent decrees against the department there. The citizens rose up, they put a measure, they passed it, and they got civilian oversight. And so like the commission, our powers are limited. It's a city charter, so we have to get the voters, whether it's going to be a signature collecting campaign. So it's up to the citizens of the city to push that forward. I doubt any city council will ever just, give civilian oversight. I think the civilians have to demand that.
You don't hear any interest from the council on that at all? I know that was discussed before the board was reformed.
I think it has to be more well-defined. The city does have civilian oversight, but that oversight, which is in my office, is limited to policies and procedures, and then some areas of training, implementation. So it depends on what you're looking for. And just up until recently, I've been doing this for 12 years. I've been in office of one up until a year ago. So unfortunately, it does take big incidents to make change sometimes. If you go back from the beginning of me doing this job, if you look at the recommendations that I put out to the police and fire department regarding changes, it's a lot of the stuff you guys are arguing and complaining about now. But like I said, I was in office of one, so I don't know what happened to them. But it's a movement, and you have to basically keep continuing. And if I could just add one thing, I know there is a lot of focus on the police department, but if you talk about where you can really make a lot of the changes that are necessary, it has to come with health care for mental health. Doing this for as long as I've been doing it, that is quite often the common denominator. And the police department come at the very last brink of somebody being in some form of crisis, whether it's with their family or the position they're in their life. I think probably about a year and a half ago, I did a little bit of research on it, and 75% of the people that we had shot in the police department were armed with something less than a firearm. And the majority of them were in some form of mental health crisis. So as a mother myself of 2 black young men, one who deals with some depression and mental health issues, it also strikes very close to home, but the police department is not necessarily the answer that we need to go to get these issues dealt with. So I would say take this movement, rally around it, and make some supreme differences and changes with the things that are available to people who are in the midst of crisis, because you're not going to get the answers you need from the police department. And there's a guy in the back who's had his hand up for about 30 minutes, so if we can go ahead and please let him ask that question. All the way in the back.
Yeah, this is the last question, I think.
We got 4 minutes left.
All right, then I'll make it 1 minute question. We'll do it real quick. All right. When I'm surprised is up here is I don't see anybody with a disability up here who has a mental health. I have mental health, and I've been stopped by the police 3 times. Okay, question. I want to kind of follow up what you just said. What is police officers doing now to make sure they have mental health training so we don't have what happened to Joseph Mann on my street on Del Paso Boulevard, where he was shot and killed? And this is not the first time when somebody with mental health has been roughed up by the police officers because they don't understand us or who we are. Thank you.
I think you were talking to Francine, but I'll take that. So first and foremost, I'd like to say, to me, mental health crisis playing out in our street when police respond falls into basically 2 categories for me. One is the initial response, what happens in that, and then one is basically what happens after that, the follow-up. I think we've gotten, especially since Joseph Mann, we've gotten a lot better at the initial response, meaning that all officers now have less lethal tools such as beanbag shotguns, 40mm launchers, and things like that. And they've been used quite a bit on a lot of mental health crises playing out in the street. What we have to continue to get much better at is what do we do after, not as only a police department, but as a community. So one of the things that council approved probably 4 or 5 months ago was a full-time social worker in the police department. We're still in the process of hiring that person. And then creating a mental health team that basically does follow-up with county and other partners, so we lessen the amount of times that an officer and somebody in mental health crisis are in that close proximity in some sort of potentially violent situation. And so I completely agree with Francine. As a community, as a society, we have to get much better at that, because ultimately when that goes unaddressed, somebody gets hurt. Either the person in mental health crisis hurts somebody, hurts themselves, or the police officer and the person in mental health crisis get into it and somebody gets hurt there. None of those are what we want to see, so we just have to get better. And the reason why the police department has to be involved in it all the time, at least the way we do business now, is because when somebody's in mental health crisis on the street, people only call one number, and that's 911. And so an officer has to have the training you're talking about and has to have the ability and knowledge of how do we get this person to somebody that can help long-term as opposed to just this 10 minutes. So we have to stabilize the situation in a safe way, and then we have to set up a system that can, the best possible way, deal with this person and get them the help they need so we don't keep coming out every day. Because every time we come out is another opportunity for them to hurt somebody before we get there or for something to happen while we're there.
Well, I think that's about all the time that we have, so we can get a round of applause for our panel. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Good night.